Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability for today's Research for People and Planet webinar on rebuilding Ukraine, energy infrastructure and energy security. My name is Patricia Fabian. I'm an associate director at the Institute and an associate professor of environmental health. We're delighted to welcome everyone who's joined us and encourage you to visit IGS's website at bu.edu/IGS for the Institute's research on planetary and environmental health, climate governance, and energy systems to advance a sustainable and equitable future. A bit on logistics, the recording for today's webinar will be available on IGS's website and emailed to everyone who registered by early next week. Throughout the talk, please post your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom to be answered at the end of the talk. And thank you to participants who sent questions in advance as well. With that, I'll introduce our speaker, is Dr. Derek Evanson, an associate professor in environmental politics at the University of Edinburgh and a senior research scientist here at the Institute. His research focuses on public and policy responses to energy and climate issues, including public reactions to new and controversial energy technologies and local and national responses to global climate governance. His work has been published in leading journals, including Nature Climate Change and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. With that, Derek, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you all for joining us. This I was going to say this afternoon. I'm based in Scotland at the moment, but this morning, I think for probably most of you. Let me just bring up my my slides here, and let me get it going. And then, Patricia, could you just confirm? Are we good here?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent. So again, thank you. This is a bit of work that my colleagues listed on the slide here and I put together for a white paper, which we originally published in October of last year, October 2022. And at the time, we were sort of interested in rebuilding Ukraine and what energy infrastructure would look like in general. And that was well before the heaviest of the assaults on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure in advance of the winter. And so this has sort of taken on a new meaning since those recent attacks. Although not a lot has changed in terms of Ukraine's plans, we'll actually see. But it's certainly even it's heightened, and I think in the public consciousness at least, the need to focus on energy infrastructure and energy security going forward in Ukraine. So as I mentioned, we have a white paper out, and a lot of the conclusions are, I think, still quite relevant, even though some of the data on the level of damage needs to be substantially updated since that time. I have the updated slides that I'll share with you today. So there's a link here, and we also have the white paper available in Ukrainian, if anyone out there is interested in that version. So it was only a week or so after we published this white paper that headlines such as the following came in. So we published that in mid-October, and all of these are from mid to late October. And as you can see, I'm guessing that most of the people who are on this call would be interested in Ukrainian energy in some form or another, and there certainly has been a lot of damage and very specific targeting of energy infrastructure. I believe it's something about 100 major transformers have been destroyed. A very large percentage of the power plants, as you can see from this one article from The Guardian here, and multiple million Ukrainians have been without power at certain times over the last several months. So that was back in October. All of these headlines here, I pulled them just last night, trying to update, and this is sort of where we are today. So still, we can see that Russia is very much targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure as a way to sort of disable and demoralize the country, and to really bring the citizen lifestyle to its knees. And so with the top right corner here, you can see this just junk of text. This is actually an excerpt screenshot that I pulled from the February 2nd statement from Ursula von der Leyen, the leader of the president of the European Commission. And so this is the European Union's statement on its relationship with Ukraine. And there was a very large section focusing on how Europe, the European Union, that is, the 27 countries, will be supporting Ukraine in relation to energy infrastructure going forward. And as we might talk about, as I'll mention in a few minutes, a lot of what Europe wants to do with Ukraine in relation to energy infrastructure will probably in many ways determine what the rebuilding looks like, because so much of the money is coming from support internationally. So even though we have been hearing a lot about damage to energy infrastructure, especially over these last several months, overall, in terms of the total amount of damage, energy actually plays a relatively small role. Now, that's just, I'm talking about overall damage. I mean sort of financial damage, not what it does to ability of a country to function. Energy is obviously extremely important in terms of the ability of the country to continue going on providing services to its people and even engaging in the war effort. However, for our white paper, and you can get more of the details there, we looked at several different estimates. Now there's not as many coming out, but in sort of May, June, July, numerous different estimates of what the damage was to Ukrainian infrastructure and what the cost of reconstruction was going to be. Now, most of the estimates are between 200 and 1,000 billion, that would be $1 trillion, dollars. And the 750 estimate has been given as a central estimate by a number of different sources. However, that estimate, when you hear that mentioned, that's the cost of reconstruction, which includes substantial amounts of money put towards modernization of the infrastructure. So it's not building it back as it was, it's, in the colloquial term, building back better. So here's some data that I've compiled from the Kiev School of Economics, has been keeping one of the most robust tallies of damage to various different infrastructure over time. And so you can see here at the end, I don't know if you can see my mouse zooming around the screen, but the estimate is almost at $140 billion of actual damage. So now, again, this is different from the 750 billion, because that's what it would take to build back all of that infrastructure in a more modernized form. So this is estimates of damage today that can be sort of documented in a reliable fashion. There's images, there's reliable estimates for what things cost. But you can see, even from the very beginning, this is only 2 weeks into the war, already there was about $55 billion worth of estimated damage had occurred. And so it's worth reflecting that we're hearing a lot about the energy infrastructure now, but a lot of the original damage came from major assaults in the very early days of the war on housing and transport infrastructure. And we can see that from this chart. This is broken down, it's that same data from the previous slide, but broken down across sectors. So we can see up here, this red line is damage to housing infrastructure. See, at about 55 billion, sorry, the y-axis is going here, but $55 billion worth of damage about housing infrastructure. This is transport infrastructure. It actually goes down at some point, but that's because it just changes in the methodology of calculating the estimates. And this is all from the Kiev School of Economics again. And this line down here, it's like a dark blue at the bottom that you can see slowly creeping up. Well, it climbs quite a bit from in the autumn. This is the energy infrastructure. So you can see, even though there's a focus on it, it's not huge in terms of some of the other sectors affected. Oh, this is just a zoomed in view, taking out some of the really big ticket items, but you can see energy climbing from sort of beginning of September. We can see it's climbing up a lot in the autumn, the amount of damage. So this slide here is just to say that I am using Kiev School of Economics data. There might be questions about, I mean, this is an academic institute at a university, but there might be questions about, well, to what extent is it sort of impartial or genuine data. There was a major study done by the European Commission and the World Bank on damages to Ukrainian infrastructure, and it pairs almost exactly with the estimates coming out of the Kiev School of Economics data, which gives us reason to believe that's a very reliable and robust source. However, one of the things about this data is that, remember, there's separate concepts that we're dealing with here. What's the damage? What's the recovery? And so it's just that recovery is generally over 300% of the cost of recovery of what has actually been damaged. Again, the numbers especially from this June 1st, 2020 report are outdated. They don't account for the efficiency improvements, which will be one of the main ways that Ukraine seeks to build back, particularly in relation to energy, from this war. So they had Ukraine has a national recovery plan that was put out in early July of 2022, and include a lot of items related to energy. Now I'm going to go through these quickly, but I just want to put them out there on the screen so you can just look at the numbers that I have in bold. Think about sort of the magnitude of what they're hoping to focus on in reconstruction related to energy. So we see some money for district, so this is in billions of US dollar equivalent here. Some money for district heating, air source heat pumps, biomass, some money for building out additional gigawatt capacity of renewable energy, also hydro. Still a reasonable amount of money for exploring for more availability of gas. This is sort of a near-term focus that Ukraine wants, having additional gas fields, which may include things like unconventional gas development, hydraulic fracturing, things like that. This is explicitly in the pan that they're looking for. Nuclear expansion, even more of that, which may be surprising to some based on what you've heard about sort of security concerns related to that. Additional work in biomass, building out their fuel stocks. Hydrogen generation and distribution, huge amount allocated there. I'll talk about more of that in a few minutes. And energy efficiency. You can see that's the huge item at the end there. Really focusing on sort of insulation, not losing electricity in the grid, much more substantial resilient and sustainable infrastructure. But what were the challenges before the war? Very high efficiency, especially in district heating, and Ukraine has a much higher percentage of district heating in its housing stock than I think any other country in the world, but certainly more than any of the countries I've focused on in Europe and North America. Old, poorly insulated housing. A lot of that housing has been destroyed, so there's obviously thoughts about what happens going forward. Russian reliance, very heavily reliant on Russia for supplying its natural gas, but also on the fuel stocks for its nuclear power. 100% Ukraine was relying on Russia for supplying uranium for its nuclear power. Limited renewables production before the war, lack of decentralized power options, just a lot of huge power plants. Solar and wind is in the south, which is where Russia predominantly is at the moment, and security concerns associated with nuclear. So in my last, I think about 5 minutes here, apologies if I'm speaking fast. My students have mentioned this. I'll try to breathe for a second, or maybe I'll take a swig of water, and that can give you pause to digest what I've said. Some opportunities and approaches. As I said before, from that line chart that we saw, line graph or whatever it is, in housing, over 55, well, it's almost exactly 55 billion now of damage has been done for housing. And so obviously a huge opportunity to build back differently in terms of housing. Very large number of you. That number there is outdated. I couldn't find a reliable source to up that on. Numbers from October of housing units damaged. So probably close to about 1 million now. Very high reconstruction. And there's some areas in particular that have been really decimated in terms of the effect on the amount of housing infrastructure destroyed. And those could be potentially demonstration sites for how to build back, much more sustainable, much more sort of low low carbon or even carbon neutral sort of housing, opportunities for really high levels of insulation, functional district heating systems, because district heating doesn't really work if you don't have very well insulated, or district heating with heat pump or heat pumps as well don't really work if you have poor insulation in your infrastructure. So energy efficiency improvements, the heat pumps. Question of green hydrogen, as you saw before in the numbers from the Ukrainian plan, 47 billion envisioned and requested from international actors to receive support for establishing the hydrogen system. So there's a question of is this probably going to be a major focus or not going forward? And that, sort of some questions of whether electric heating versus sort of gas style heating, but powered with hydrogen that's made from renewable energy sources, which one of these might be the better approach going forward for Ukraine. And so there's a debate on that at the moment, although there was a very high focus on speaking about hydrogen in the European Commission statement on how they're looking to support Ukraine going forward. That was the statement from last week. So certainly opportunities in renewable energy production. There is quite a lot of land in Ukraine. However, the areas where there's most potential for wind and solar, which are thought to be two of the main renewables that could be used going forward in Ukraine, it's in the south, and that is an area that is currently very questionable what the status is right now because of the Russian occupation of some areas. Certainly opportunities for biomass due to the agricultural focus of Ukraine historically. An opportunity for contribution to EU low carbon goals. And so the EU is very much trying to help out its neighbor Ukraine, but they're also very interested in how the Ukraine can help it achieve its low carbon goals. And the EU has a lot of sort of legally binding carbon targets that they have enshrined in law. And there's certainly some synergies here, which the EU is obviously very much considering when they're considering what they propose as their ways of helping out their neighbor. So pre-war, it was 12% of all electricity in Ukraine, which is a kind of a fairly low amount, came from renewable energy production. There's a goal by Ukraine to have that at 25% by 2035 of total energy, not from your renewable production, not just electricity. However, it's not a panacea. You can see even if by 2035 they reach that goal, that's still 25%. And is this renewable energy being used to create green hydrogen, or is it being used to actually go into electricity that is used commercially and domestically? And so that's a rather serious question that will have to be asked in the rebuilding of Ukraine. Also, there's interest now that the Ukraine is connected to the European electricity market, whereas before the war, it used to be connected to the Russian sort of electricity distribution system. There is some potential to export and use it as a an additional economic export if there's opportunity to even create more electricity beyond what Ukraine needs itself. Nuclear power, Ukraine was one of the highest countries of the world in terms of percentage of electricity from nuclear power as of 2020. And even with some of the occupation, hostage situations in nuclear power plants, Ukraine has, at least as of current, still planning on expanding it's expanding by 38% from the current, from 2019, still planning on expanding substantially its nuclear power. And this nuclear power could contribute to EU low carbon goals. It could be exported again, the electricity. And there might be some alternatives to large scale nuclear that could be pursued, although that is not something that has been a heavy focus in Ukraine's own reconstruction plan at the moment. I think I'm at the end here, so I'll go very quick through coal, gas, and oil. Coal, that's the one thing that it's very clear that there's just sort of no future for in Ukraine. There's a very quick coal phase out envisioned, and a number of coal-fired power plants have been destroyed, and Ukraine is very clear that it is not looking to rebuild that and continue with the coal model. Oil and gas, a little more nuanced. They're looking to keep some, shift away in some instances, but the shifting away from oil and gas is more of a medium to long-term thing in the mind of Ukraine. So I have a few points up there. I'll just go to this goals at the end. In terms of moving forward, Ukraine's own vision and what my colleagues and I would recommend is sort of diversified, still needing a lot of different energy sources. It's not that this is just, there's a shift to solar and that's it. There's still a very large need for a number of different energy sources, but keeping that diversified, having a wide portfolio, decentralized, very high, especially after the attacks of the last 5 months on the energy infrastructure, keeping a decentralized energy source, so that single places can't be targeted as easily, detached from Russia and joined up to the EU. So thank you for your time, and I think we have time for some questions.
We do. Thank you, Dr. Evanson, for a thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to ask you to maybe stop sharing your slides so it kind of pulls up faces again, and I'm remind the audience that you can post questions in the question and answer button there for the Zoom, but I'll maybe start with a couple questions that came in from participants in advance. So the first one's asks, they're curious what percentage of customers and load are with or without service at this time, and if there's a high level of service, how was that maintained despite bombing targeted to disruption?
Sure. This is this is something that I've been looking into a bit recently. It's obviously past the white paper that we wrote, but at times there's been over 1 million, close to 2 million without energy, without electricity. And for many people, that means if you don't have electricity, then you also don't have other utilities. You may have not have water as well. Now it's sort of on a rolling basis, a few 100,000 on average. Infrastructure keeps on being hit. There's one of those slides that I presented at the beginning of the articles that have come out in the last few days. It was a article from the BBC, sort of our national news source over here in the UK, and so it's about 7 days ago now. But it was an excellent article that I would recommend anyone read on a reporter who for 2 weeks was going around with the crews that were fixing the electricity infrastructure, and it's a very human tale. And it's sad in many respects, but it sort of ends positively. It shows how hard these teams from the government, from the military services, as well as from the private companies that manage the energy infrastructure, are just constantly replacing things. And there's also been a lot of support in terms of generators. I think it's about a little over 5,000 generators have been shipped in from the EU to support Ukrainian communities for when the Russian attacks do take out the infrastructure. Okay,
thank you. A second question is a little bit kind of taking a step back and thinking globally. So how much does international coordination and support determine Ukraine's ability to recover?
I would just say it's massive. I mean, Ukraine is not, especially after having to fund its defense effort over the last year, in 2 weeks exactly, it'll be a year. So for the last 50 weeks, Ukraine is sort of without finances. And just recently there's been major headlines this past week. The Ukrainian president, Zelensky, was in London to meet with British leaders, and then he was in Brussels to meet with the European Commission leaders. And it's really trying to build support for the war now, but it's trying to build a future of support. And so right now the focus is on government support, and we hopefully, when, not if, this war ends, we will be seeing probably a more shift to some of the private investment and sort of corporate investment. But I think a lot of this is very much envisioned from coming from outside of the borders of Ukraine. And that's why it's really important when thinking about the energy infrastructure. One thing that's important is Ukraine's own vision for its energy plan, but very important as well is sort of what the European Commission thinks about what they want to support. And that's obviously in dialogue, the partners, but it's not one-sided.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a question from the question and answer here on the Zoom. So it says thermal power plants are main source of Ukraine grid flexibility. And building requires flex generation. So what could be a substitution for thermal power plants from your point of view?
I mean, yeah, the district heating has been very large. I mean, and particularly in the areas where the housing stocks have been very strongly, unfortunately, very powerfully decimated. There are probably other ways to think about this. I guess there's there's this huge focus on green hydrogen to be used for heating, and so that's not sort of power plant. I mean, you're making the hydrogen someplace, but it's a bit of a different situation. I guess there is focus on some heat pumps, as you saw. 11 billion was envisioned in the Ukraine reconstruction plan for heat pumps, air source heat pumps. In reality, I mean, we're seeing stories about it being negative 20 degrees Celsius in Ukraine, and that being a problem for people without heat, and being a problem, for the military even fighting. The North is not going to do well. I'm not sure that's a really viable technology, but there's some vision for it throughout the country. And so I guess those retrofits, the 88 billion for energy efficiency, a lot of that is maybe to make housing and government buildings a lot more efficient, so that those thermal power heating plants, maybe there's not as many of them needed, or they're not as well, they're just the per housing unit, you're not losing as much energy. So yeah, it's sort of a constellation of efforts, I would say. The hydrogen, I mean, just personally, I don't 100% buy the arguments about the hydrogen, even the green hydrogen. But if you're interested, you can reach out via email, and we'll continue that conversation.
Okay, so we only have a couple minutes left. I'm going to pick this question that says, so maybe like a 60-second answer on this one would be, how do you see energy playing a role in industry and commercial bounce back when rebuilding begins?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a prerequisite, and I think that's acknowledged in the July 2022 Ukraine national plan, that you're not going to have a bounce back of industry unless you have the energy resources there to support it. And I think that rebuilding of the energy infrastructure is very much seen as an absolute necessary near-term one. However, it's not just the energy infrastructure. One of those slides, I didn't go through it in depth, that was up there from the European Commission, was talking about how it's an estimated $5 billion of recovery would just be for replenishing the gas stocks of Ukraine, and some of that is not just some of that is to supply for heating, so that people don't go without, but some of that is also for heavy industry that relies on natural gas. So yeah, certainly many roles.
Perfect. 60-second answer. So we're at 11:30. For those of you who didn't have your questions answered, I would encourage you to email Dr. Evanson directly. Thank you everyone for attending and for your interesting questions. Our next speaker at the Research for People and Planet webinar will be Dr. Benjamin Sovacool, who will talk about key climate mitigation insights from the IPCC report. And just a preview of what those are, they're around justice, energy, and transport. So again, thank you everyone, and we'll see you at our next webinar.